Okay, all right. I'm Gary Johnson. I'm an old retired engineer. I've been interested in this going to Mars thing for a long time, since I was a boy. And just to give you some idea why the hair is so white, I was 7 years old when Sputnik went up.
You're still here.
I'm still here, just barely. I think one of the vanguards is still up there. We're going to talk about colonizing Mars and how that goes. And I was intrigued by one of the earlier presenters who was talking about the lessons of history. And that's what I'm going to do, but I'm doing it from a different perspective. Now let's see if I can make this work. It's not doing anything.
Did it freeze?
I guess it did. I don't know.
Okay, what's here? Should I do this?
There we go. We could probably skip that, but just to let you know, I had 2 careers over my lifetime, 20-year career in aerospace defense. And that ended with a plant closure and mass layoffs when the industry contracted. So I had to go do something else for a living. Yeah, next 20 years was mostly teaching, but I also did a little civil engineering while I was in there. And I've since retired. And if you can't tell from the accent, I'm from Texas. And I'm retired on a cattle ranch out there, a little small cattle ranch. And one of the things I do besides dabbling with going to Mars and playing with studies like this is I kill prickly pear cactus with an implement that I invented. And you tow it around behind a tractor and you don't have to pick anything up. All you have to do is drive around on that tractor drinking beer. Okay, here's the problem. The problem with colonizing someplace off of where you are, history tells us how to do this. I'm going to look back at the history of exploring and then colonizing the new world from Europe. You could include Australia from Europe if you want to. It's just a longer transit time by sailing ship. As the slide says, history tells us more or less how this should be done, although none of the people back then did it right. I looked at what they did and what they should have done and put together this concept for how you go about really colonizing elsewhere. Okay? Trouble is, few people are listening. Now, there's 3 phases to this. This is where I'm coming at this from a technical background, and the other fellow was coming at it from more of an artistic thing. But there's 3 phases to it. The first one is exploration. Now, you want to go there in a way where you can find out what all is there, where exactly it is, and how good is it. And I mean those exactly as they're worded. When I say what all is there, you got to find everything. Not just on the surface, but below it. You don't know what the resources are going to be, but you got to find out what is there that you might be able to use. And the more successful outfits 500 years ago to 300 years ago did exactly that. All right. Now, there's not going to be any infrastructure around there. It's better if you can look at multiple locations and get a better feel for what the new country is going to look like and what it might have, because resources vary from place to place dramatically. You know, that vein of gold is there, it's not over there. It's that simple. Going to Mars is going to be the same place. That buried glacier is going to be there, not there. And you don't know how deep it is till you drill. It's that simple. Okay. Now there's an experimental base phase. Once you figured out which site or sites you want to play with, you go build experimental bases there. Now, I call them experimental bases for lack of a better word. What you're doing there is learning how to live off the land, because you're going to have some preconceived notion, you're going to have some machinery, and it's probably not going to work if Murphy's Law holds. You're going to have to do something else in order to make it work right. You experiment. You're going to be partly supplied from home because you're not going to be able to make what you need initially. It's not going to happen. All right. All right. Small crews, it's not permanently manned by the same crew. You may be trading out people with the supply flights. That's typically what's going to happen. There were very few 500 years ago that did it that way, but the most successful ones approximated that. Okay. Then after you figure out how to live off the land and what the machinery really is and how to really operate it and what you're really going to do with it, then you can start setting up permanent settlements. And now things are going to change. It's going to be permanently occupied, and you're not going to be transferring so many people back and forth, but you will be, as the facilities expand, you will be able to accept increasing numbers of permanent residents. You won't need as many supply flights from home. That's going to dry up, becomes more passenger flights. And it's going to take a while for that to happen. The infrastructure will be there to support them. And as it expands, the population can expand. And that doesn't happen in a day. It doesn't happen in the first flight. It may not happen in the first decade or two. It may take a while. It did 300, 500 years ago. It took a while for the successful colonies. Okay. Now, one thing you need to think about while you're doing the experimental base phase is there anything here that the folks back home could use? You got to think about, when there is a permanent settlement there, how are we going to do a two-way trade? Because if there's not a two-way trade, it's never going to be successful. And in fact, the legacy of not setting up that two-way trade economy is why there's so many failed states with immigrants coming to our borders in Central and South America. Spain never did that. They were pretty successful otherwise, but they didn't do that part right. All right, let's see here. So you got to worry about these things. It's the lessons. Now, phase one, I already talked about what you're doing there. That's those 3 bullets. What all is there? Where exactly is it? How much? How good is it? You know, you're going to have to drill down to find out. You're not going to do this with a little drill that goes 1 meter or 2 in the ground. You need something that can go 5, 10, 100 meters down. You not only need to find the top of that buried glacier, you need to find the bottom of it, since you know how much is down there. You need to know how much of that is really ice, and how many of those layers are mostly rock. It may be alternating layers. You don't know. You don't know till you drill. All right, extracting it. You got to figure it where it is and exactly how deep and how big it is. That determines what machinery you bring. If it's near the surface, you might use an excavator to mine it out. If it's deep, you're probably better off trying to just drill a well and inject steam and get water back up. But you're going to have to bring the stuff to do that. And you don't know until you've drilled what machinery to bring. You can't bring both. Mass is a problem if you're traveling by rocket. We don't have flying saucers yet. All right. Now, so there's the characteristics of phase one. Here's the experimental base thing. What you're doing there is you're using the Martian air, which is mostly carbon dioxide, as a source of carbon and some oxygen atoms. And you're using the water as more oxygen atoms and hydrogen atoms. And you're recovering the water. You may have to treat it. It may be quite briny. It could be dirty. There's no telling what else is polluting it. You got to do water treatment. Until you get that water, you don't know what water treatment you got to apply, do you? We've got a cart before the horse problem here if we try to do this too fast. Okay? Once we know, you start treating that stuff, you make that water, you electrolyze it, you've got hydrogen and oxygen, and you can recombine that with the CO2 and you can get methane. So you can make a couple of different kinds of rocket propellants depending on who you're trying to service and refill. And you're also making drinking water, and you're making irrigation water for your greenhouses, and you're making oxygen to breathe. But you gotta know where this stuff is and how you're going to have to treat it to make this work. What machinery do you bring? If you've only got 100 tons of payload, what are you going to bring? You won't know until you drill. It's that simple. But we put this thing together and we're learning how to live off the land. That's the one bullet. The other one is, what might the folks back home use? What might we ship home for a two-way trade 10, 20, 30 years from now? What might they use besides intellectual property or something like that? That's easy to transmit home. This other stuff is hard. All right, let's see here. Phase 2. I think we got that beaten to ground. Thriving colony is phase 3. Now, what's going on there is you've got homes, you've got greenhouses, you've got workplaces. They can all be the same kind of building, maybe. You just got to build a bunch of buildings. You're going to need a concrete substitute. You're going to need steel. You're going to need glass. You're going to need all kinds of things. You got to figure out in that experimental base phase how to do this. You don't know ahead of time. We're not going to know ahead of time until we go there. All right. You've also got a lot of rockets landing and a lot of rockets taking off, and you're making the propellant for them to take off. We know how and where the people are going to live and what they're going to do for a living. So now we're accepting people, and as the more dwelling places and workplaces that there are, the more people we can accept. And you don't want to get that out of balance, because how are you going to feed them? What are you going to give them to breathe? See, you got to time this thing right. It's got to come in balance. All right, but that's the characteristics of a thriving colony. Now, I did a study a while back on the big ships to support the colonization phase. We're not talking about Mars Direct or Starship Super Heavy to Mars or anything like that. We're talking about something 50 years from now. Talking about big orbit to orbit transports. They might have a space tug stage at each end of the journey. They might not. I don't know. You're talking about not sending 100 tons at a time. You're talking about sending thousands. These are big ships. I did it with conventional propellants. I did it nuclear. I looked at it. I did all this stuff and played with it. And yeah, it's orbit to orbit. And at each end of that journey for that big ship, you're going to need the analog to the lighter. In the sailing ship days, before they had we were able to construct big harbors, you'd sail into the protected water, but you couldn't beach the ship. It's too big. So they bring small boats out, and that's what they unload the cargo with. And when you're going somewhere else, that's what they bring the cargo out with. It's small boats. It's a lighter. Okay. It's a ferry. You're going to need a ferry. You're going to need a good transportation system between the Earth's surface and Earth orbit to transport all this stuff up, put it on that big ship, bring it to Mars. You're going to need a ferry at Mars, some kind of a ferry to go from the surface to orbit, transfer payloads, and come back down. Two-way, one-stage, reusable. And it's feasible with chemical propellant. I just did a presentation an hour ago. Starship will actually do that job. I ran the numbers for it. Okay, so you can do these things. This is just one possible proposal. There are many possible proposals. When I was young, they were talking about nuclear explosion propulsion to push a 12,000-ton spaceship between planets like that. It was the old Project Orion that General Atomics did for the Air Force back in the 1950s. And it would have worked. It had some side effects. They didn't even know about them, but it would work. All right, now, who best does what? Phase 1 exploration, now, just like it was way back then, it starts out more or less government mandated. They're going to fund a lot of stuff. They might pay for the missions. So far they have. And then the exception to that might be Mr. Musk himself. He might mount some missions to Mars before NASA can get around to it. Okay, we don't know. But between the rich corporate interests and the government, people are going to go to Mars and do the exploration phase. Okay, you're talking about one or two or a small handful of ships, small crews. They don't stay there all that long. They're there to find out what all is there, where exactly it is, and how you're going to, what quality it is, how much you're going to get. Okay. Now, phase 2, the experimental bases, more properly done as it was 300 years ago, more or less. I'm talking about the Dutch East India Company. It's a partnership between the government and the corporations. Okay, and you kind of set up a monopoly and you go do this thing. That's what they did. It was more or less successful. All right, it's more led by the private interest than it is the government. Government pretty good at going out and saying, hey, we put the flag on the moon. But the guys that are going to make the profit are the ones that are going to go back and keep going back. Okay, that's what's going to happen. It's cooperatively done at this phase. You got small populations, you got lots of small cargoes, supplies from home lessen as this experimental base phase. They start learning how to really live off the land and not starve to death or suffocate. Later on, the thriving colony, usually the governments on the successful ones have very little to do with that. That's all private interest of one kind or another. Okay. And there's been some successes and there's been some failures. You know, I can point to the Roanoke colony as one of the failures, and Jamestown almost was. They very nearly starved to death because they weren't doing this process right when they set that up. Okay. It has serious consequences if you screw this up. All right, it's not until you get to that thriving colony that you're going to need that great big ship with those massive payloads. The rest of that can be done with what we're contemplating now. Okay. You got to do it right. So that's kind of my repeat slide, and we're back to the 3 phases: who's doing it, what you're doing, and what the infrastructure is going to look like. By the time you get to this colony phase down there, you're going to have radar beacons, you're going to have concrete landing pads, you're going to have transportation between the landing zone and where the people really are, because you don't want the landing pad in the middle of your colony. What happens if somebody screws up and crashes? It's gonna happen. Murphy's Law says so. It's gonna happen. It always has. Okay, so you're going to have all this infrastructure in that phase. You're going to be developing that infrastructure, or at least the prototypes for it, during the experimental base phase, and you ain't going to have hardly anything during the exploration phase. You might as well be camping out in the spaceship you landed in. It's that simple. Does that make sense? Everybody okay with that? I think, yeah, that's about all I got. I was trying to draw a parallel between what should have been done 300 to 500 years ago and usually wasn't done right, okay, and what we're about to do, trying to set up cities on Mars. We need to do this right. The difference is 300, 500 years ago, you sailed to another land over there, you got air to breathe, and if you look around a little bit, you got water to drink. You just got to worry about growing food. You go to Mars, you got to worry about food, you got to worry about water, you got to worry about air to breathe. It's hostile. You cannot screw this up. So I guess questions? I saw him first.
Hi, thank you for the very interesting presentation. So my question is, in which stage would you propose to take the terraforming process? Because I noticed that you're talking at least half a century in some of the stages, and by that point, I imagine that terraform in terms of changing the climate.
Yeah. I would expect that you'd probably want to start thinking about exactly how you might want to do the terraforming while you're doing the experimental base. And you're still in that phase when you start setting up the real colony. And sometime after that colony is actually beginning to thrive, by that time you might know enough to actually go and do the terraforming. But that's going to take time for that to happen. It depends on how you do it, but it could take decades or centuries or maybe even millennia to fully transform Mars. It's pretty desiccated. You got to do something about that thin atmosphere. Yes, sir.
What do you propose would be the first Mars export?
I don't know.
I propose Martian tequila.
I'll drink to that.
Along those lines, do you envision any feedback from Mars to the Earth to the governments or the private concerns that started the Mars colonies in the first place in time?
I would expect that the people living on Mars, I've heard more than one presentation here at this conference talking about that feedback. They're going to develop political systems and economic systems that work for them there. And some of that might be a new idea to try here. It's, like I said, one of the major exports is probably going to be intellectual property, which can be transmitted by radio. So, yeah, I think there's going to be feedback. Yes, sir.